Kia ora, welcome to Conversations with Wāhine, brought to you by the Wellington branch of the National Council of Women, New Zealand. Today we are speaking with Mt Roskill MP Michael Wood. Michael was first elected at the 2016 Mt Roskill by-election. In opposition, he was Labour's spokesperson for Transport, Revenue and Consumer Affairs. He also had roles as Parliamentary Under-Secretary to the Minister for Ethnic Communities and Chair of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, before coming into the Chief Labour Whip role in mid-2019. Following the 2020 general election, Michael was appointed the role of Minister of Transport and Minister of Workplace Relations and Safety. He was also Deputy Leader of the House. In June 2022, he became Minister of Immigration, and in January 2023, he was awarded additional responsibilities, such as Minister for Auckland and Associate Minister of Finance. Thank you for joining us today, Michael.
Kia ora, nice to be with you.
I am personally interested in this question myself. You might be able to see the art back there. But you did also graduate with a Bachelor in Arts before entering Parliament. And while art and politics are usually considered polar opposites, there is a familiar sense of subjectivity that comes with a passion and difference of opinion, despite many politicians trying to take an evidence-based approach. Why is it so hard to come to a consensus in Parliament? And how has your background in the arts influenced your stance as a politician now?
I've never had an opening question like that before, but it's a really good one. And I think I agree with part of the sentiment that you're expressing there. I'm a really firm believer that politics shouldn't just be a technocratic exercise. I think that's actually very alienating for people in a democracy. Politics should be an opportunity for people in all parts of society, whether it's elected politicians like myself, people in communities, those with an interest in particular issues, organised grouping in our society, business, unions, whoever it is, to be able to advocate for what they think is best for our communities and for our country. And I know that sometimes people, when they see some of what we do in politics, which is the arguing side and some of the argy-bargy, can find that a bit alienating, and we have to find ways of doing that better. But politics in the end is about how we make really important decisions in our society, including key distributional questions about who gets what and how we do it and how we manage power relationships in our society. There's a lot at stake. And actually, at times, that's stuff that you need to fight for, and economic interests will play out, and you'll sometimes have to really, try and make the progress you want to, not just by advocating your ideas, but by arguing them out and sometimes beating back other ideas and those with vested interests. So it can be a robust business, and I think as long as that is done respectfully, and I think as long as it's inclusive, then that's not a bad thing. For me, I came into politics because I have got some really core beliefs in the dignity of every single person and their right to be able to reach their potential in life. A core belief that we're not just atomized individuals, that we're best when we live together in communities and support one another mutually, and that we have a duty to future generations to look after the earth that we live on. And all of those things in different ways have influenced the way that I think about the world and my motivations for getting involved in politics and fighting for the things I believe in.
Yeah, I think that's really nicely put. Like, a lot of politicians kind of touch on the same things, that the media sees one thing and the public sees one thing about how politicians are always just arguing with each other and attacking each other, I guess, especially during campaign time. But at the end of the day, it kind of is about, the better of New Zealand and for the community as a whole as well. So So I guess I want to know what actually, how did you get into politics to start off with, given, your degree was in arts and you kind of came through maybe a slightly different route to a lot of other politicians. And how did your family and friends react and support this career decision when you made the choice that you wanted to run?
Yeah, well, the degree that I did was in the arts and covered politics, history, art history, and they were all really all of those areas of study are about understanding the world that we live in and the ideas that shape our societies. And I guess those are the things that I've always been interested in, and they've certainly been useful in politics. And I did a little bit of law as well. I just always had an interest in politics, and it wasn't particularly out of my family situation. My family wasn't deeply involved in politics or anything like that. But I just always had a really strong interest in how change occurs in a society. And you can, in New Zealand or in other countries, you can look at decisions that have been made at different points in history and the consequences that they've had 10 or 20, 30 or more years later. And I've just always been immensely interested in that. Why have we ended up the kind of society that we have, and how would that have been different if we hadn't have had the first Labour government in the 1930s or 40s, or if the reform process in the 1980s and 90s had opened us up to market forces had it been done differently as it was in some other places. How would we be different, and could we have done that in a better way? So I've always been fascinated in that, and how you build support for positive change in any organisation or any country. I first got involved when I was at university. It's fair to say probably when I was younger, my politics swung a little bit the other way, just because of the community that I lived in and some of the influences that I'd had. But, you sort of get to your late teens and you start thinking for yourself and thinking about the values that are really important for you and finding your own way in the world. And I kind of worked out where I stood on these things. In the late 90s were also a period where that was under the national government we had at that time, the Jim Bolger, Jenny Shipley government. And it was a period of radical right-wing politics in New Zealand, privatisation, diminishment of public services, massive fee hikes in tertiary education where I was going to university. And I remember very clearly was it 1998, 1999, when I was at university, the power went out in Auckland for weeks on end. We didn't have power. And it was just kind of a metaphor, for me anyway, for the way in which the basic things that were really important for people to be able to live healthy, decent lives had kind of been forgotten about at the same time that the most wealthy and powerful people were doing very well under that government. And that kind of underscored for me the importance of getting involved in politics and trying to change that situation, which we did in 99 when Labour won the election. My family were always supportive. My immediate family don't necessarily share my political views, but they've always been supportive and encouraging of me. All of my grandparents were Labour people kind of in the early days of the Labour Party. But even my close family members who maybe have different views on things generally say, okay, we're not with you on this particular issue and we might vote a different way, but they've always kind of been there for me when I've needed them.
That's fantastic. Michael, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but you're actually the first man that we've featured on this podcast. This has been by design, given our slogan is amplifying the voices of women. However, we do recognise that men are an indivisible part of achieving gender equality in New Zealand, and we all have so much to gain from dismantling the restrictive gender roles and expectations that suppress all of us, not just women. So we would like to know, what is gender equality to you, and what should be the role that men take in this issue for all of us?
Thank you. I feel a little bit honoured by that, and maybe a little bit anxious about how I'm representing.
No need to be anxious.
For me, as the very first person to be here, but thanks for the opportunity. I mentioned before that some of my beliefs about politics, in the end, the truth is that a lot of politics does come down to where power sits in a society, who exercises it, how they exercise it, who gets to have a voice at the table and who doesn't. And so probably I view your question through that framework a little bit. And for me, that means that if you believe in things like justice and equality and the dignity of all people, and you have some power, as we try to achieve in politics, then your duty is to use that politics to make sure that everyone does have a genuine seat at the table and a genuine voice in how we make decisions and how we solve problems and how we make things better. And so my approach to ensuring that women have full access to the rights that they are entitled to and are able to realise their potential is to work within the political system to make sure that women have that voice. And that means that women are able to speak for themselves, bring forward the issues that are important for them and bring their unique perspective into decision making rather than, well-minded men and other people making those decisions for them. And so in government, that's been really important for us. Getting down to the tin tax, and we're quite proud of this as a government. We've now got 50% of women on all of our government boards, and that's just sort of been the slow work of saying we know that there are great women out there. Our systems just haven't been geared towards identifying them and giving them the opportunity to serve. And so you put active things in place to make sure that happens. We did that with our cabinet, and we achieved that during this term. And at least 50% of the people around the highest decision-making table in the country are now women, bringing forward that perspective for women. So it's probably a lot else I could say on that, but for me, that would be the core thing. As decisions are being made, as power is being exercised, as important questions are being considered, what do we do to make sure that women aren't just being, consulted, aren't just able to vote for people, but women are there to make decisions and play their full part in building this country.
That's a great answer. On the topic of equality, while Labour have worked on fairer paid parental leave, they did recently shoot down National's proposed bill of shared parental leave. This was supported by other parties, and the bill could have enabled parents to choose a balance in labour that works for their family and enabled women to have more independence, as well as fathers. It would give them a chance to build a deeper connection with their newborns. Essentially, it would create more equality and freedom of choice for families as a whole. But what are the negatives to a bill such as this, and why not give families that choice?
Yeah, look, parental leave, and in particular access to paid parental leave, are really, really important. And we're very proud of what we've achieved in this space. It was the previous Labour government that brought paid parental leave in. Originally it was 12 or 14 weeks under the previous Labour government. At that stage, we were one of only 2 or 3 countries in the developed world that didn't have access to paid parental leave. So we brought that through. And in this term of government, we've had a staged extension to 26 weeks of paid parental leave, as well as making other improvements. So it's always been something that we've really championed. And I won't go uber political in this discussion, but it's always something that the National Party's voted against when it's actually come down to it, including when we were in opposition and we had a members' bill up that had a majority of votes in Parliament to extend paid parental leave. They vetoed it. So I don't give too much credit to the National Party in this area. We've had this particular issue come up in recent weeks where we have had a members' bill that's come through to enable some of that paid parental leave to be shared with the other partner. We're in a bit of a funny stage of the political cycle at the moment. We were coming towards the end of the Parliament, and parties are kind of in the process of developing their own policy that we'll be taking to the election about what we will do in a whole range of areas. And the Labour Party will develop its policy on parental leave and present that to people as a part of the election campaign. So probably on this issue, we're in a slightly funny and awkward position at the moment where we have voted against this bill, but we haven't yet quite got to the point where we've said, and here's what we would do instead. So that's probably just the one thing I just bring into the discussion, and just ask people, just keep an eye out in the coming period for when we do release our policy, because that'll flesh things out a bit further as to what we would do instead of just what we wouldn't do. There were 2 particular issues with this bill. I've previously been a minister with responsibility for the paid parental leave legislation, so I know it pretty well. The legislation itself is a bit of a mess. It's kind of been developed over 20 years. It's very ad hoc. Bits have been added on. It's very inflexible in a whole range of ways for women and families. My view is that probably that law overall needs a good overall review and reform to make it better. So, an example has been that previously women who have had income mixed from self-employment and employment haven't been able to add those two bits of income together to meet the qualifying period. There's been absolutely no flexibility around the qualifying period for people who are very close. There's a whole lot of things that need tidying up. And our view, when we look closely at the drafting of this bill, is that it would potentially create some additional issues. The second thing, which is an issue we do think needs to be worked through, is that this bill would have effectively ended up with the overall 26-week period for the woman who had the baby being reduced. And we had brought that 26 weeks in because all of the evidence said to us that providing that level of time was really, really important. This bill would give some more flexibility to whānau, but it would be at the expense of reducing that 26-week period. So we just want to have a bit of a look at that and think about the best way of doing it. And as I say, when we roll our policy out, hopefully all people will be able to see that we've got a good alternative that gives a really good benefit to families.
That's good to know. Yeah, and I guess like a lot of countries, well, especially a lot of countries in what we call the first world, are kind of all in this similar stage where they're looking at how to improve their parental leave and how to make it a bit more fairer on both parents as well. So that's good to hear. Also, on terms of females and, you know, them in the workplace, in your time in Parliament, what have your observations been in terms of how your female colleagues are treated by your peers and also the media compared to male MPs? Because we know that media, for one, can always skew the narrative a lot.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things there. One is that it's a harsh environment all round. And I think it has become harsher in some ways in recent years. When you're a public figure in politics or in other fields, you are exposed to critique, and sometimes that can be pretty challenging and pretty difficult for everyone who serves there, regardless of gender. And some of the trends in our discourse over recent years, particularly the way in which social media has opened up opportunities for, I think people to engage in pretty awful dialogue, has just kind of become commonplace, has made it more difficult for everyone. And some of the disinformation, conspiratorial fringe stuff that's really taken a bit of hold over the last few years has added fuel to that. Then my observation is that layered on top of that, unfortunately, many women in public life still face an additional layer of contempt, misogyny, and a focus on things that men don't face. So in particular, the focus and some of the disgusting stuff that will be said around appearance or the way that people live their lives or raise their families. There's definitely an aspect there that women politicians face more than male politicians face. And so what is already a difficult and challenging environment for everyone is just kind of all of that extra stuff. And I think, most obviously in recent years, I think many people have been pretty shocked by what they've seen that people like Jacinda had to face in her time in office. And no one should have to put up with that sort of level of abuse, misogyny, and deep personal attack. We all know that when we do this work, that we're debating in a contested space, and the things that we say, the policies we pursue should all be fair game. Should always be robust debate about that. You need that in a democracy. And sometimes when in politics we slip up, then you do also get opened up to there being a critique of you personally. But some of the deeply sexist and personal stuff I see my female colleagues facing is just not acceptable. It is something we need to face up to, because if we want to live in a genuine, functioning and healthy democracy, women at all levels need to feel comfortable and welcome to participate and put themselves forward and contribute.
Also, a follow-on from that question, do you think like the way that social media is going and how there's all these keyboard warriors, more and more coming up every day, do you think that puts our future generation off wanting to become politicians in the future or wanting to have a job in the public eye?
At a general level, it's one of the things that worries me the most at the moment is that very high level of invective that particularly comes through social media channel just puts people off politics full stop. It can just be so ugly and so confrontational that I think a lot of people just don't even want to know about it, let alone even thinking about, boy, one day would I like to become a politician and kind of be having to deal with this. I think it must have the effect for some people of putting them off being involved in that way. And that's not healthy for our democracy. And unfortunately, we know that some of this is, some of it is the sort of the nature of social media. I go out and about in my community a lot. I see, thousands and thousands of people in any given year. And actually the vast majority of people, we're talking 98, 99% of people, even if they disagree with you, will be pretty civil face to face with you. They'll kind of say their piece. But there's actually nothing there that's rude or offensive or threatening or menacing. But there is something about the medium of social media where people are at a distance, as you say, keyboard warriors. They don't have to look you in the eye. They don't have to use you. Where some people feel a greater level of comfort in engaging in that threatening, menacing, sometimes violent kind of dialogue. So there's something that we've really got to grapple with as a society, and it's not just New Zealand. And then secondly, particularly in the post-COVID period, we have had an extremist, conspiracy-laden fringe, which has really been whipped up by organised interests, which has made some of this even worse. And, I was just actually talking with a few colleagues the other day, and one of the things that we've noticed in recent times, we'll put something up on social media, just Labour Party's putting this policy out, or we went to this thing. And we've noticed that one of the new techniques, there's a group of people sort of on the fringe that's come out of anti-vax, pro-Russia, etc., who will then share your stuff around. And usually you see lots of shares on your Facebook page. You think, that's great, people are reading my stuff. And what it is, it's feeding it out to a network of people who will then come in and pile on with the really super ugly stuff. And so it gets used as quite an organised tool for that sort of behaviour. We've got to work this through as a society. We've got to work it through with the tech companies, because if that stuff grows and grows, that puts people not just off standing, but just even thinking about, talking about and being involved in politics. And that is bad for our democracy and our society.
Now, Michael, as a key parliamentary member during the COVID crisis, what are your reflections on your last term, and what would you change now?
Boy, it was such a hard period for everyone, for people in politics who had to make decisions, but just for everyone. It was 3 years, and I'm here in Auckland, and in particular, I just think about how hard it's been in this city. Multiple lockdowns we had to go through, periods of restriction, a whole lot of uncertainty, just a lot of people getting really sick, and how that brings you down when it keeps happening and can isolate many, many people. We obviously, as a country, did a lot of stuff really well. And I was just looking at another piece of international research that came out today that confirmed that our people first, health-led approach that Jacinda and Labour led meant that we had one of the best outcome in the world in terms of human health. We actually increased average life expectancy in our country over the period of the pandemic, when for many countries it went drastically back in the other direction. So a lot went well. I think the hardest stuff was how you do maintain cohesion through that period. And we kind of know how that curve went, that in that initial period, first lockdown and everything, everyone really felt in it together. There was a sense of shared purpose. We got on with things, people supported one another. And it just becomes harder to maintain over a period of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years and more, as people get tired and worn out and stressed and worried. And so I think you can never go back and say, we should have done this differently, we should have done that differently. But if we have to, heaven forbid, go through something like that again, I just think really putting the thought as a society into how we keep in there together as much as possible over a long period is probably a really, really important thing to do, because you've got to look after each other when things are tough. And some of the difficult stuff we've seen coming out of the back end, the parliamentary occupation and some of the extremist rhetoric and conspiracy theories that vulnerable people have often ended up kind of going down the rabbit hole of, that comes out of people who didn't feel fully included or were worried about stuff or had a really hard time. And I think as much as you can try and keep everyone in the tent, that's really important. And that would be probably my main reflection.
Oh, yeah. On the subject of looking after each other, post-COVID, our annual net migration gain is increasing, with recent migrant arrivals up far above the pre-COVID average. You're also increasing the quantity of higher skilled workers to fill job shortages in New Zealand. While there are many positives to this, we are in a housing crisis, and more than 3,000 Kiwis are living in hotels and emergency housing due to lack of supply and affordability. And more New Zealanders are actually choosing to move overseas. So how do we plan to house and retain our migrants once they arrive? And will our highly skilled workers be more likely to impact the rental or the sales market?
It's a really important set of questions, and it kind of goes to the important role that immigration plays in our economy, our social fabric, and our infrastructure. For people who are interested in this topic, there's a really, really good report that Dr. Ganesh Nana and the Productivity Commission completed at the end of last year, end of 2022, I think. And it's a broad sort of review of how the immigration system has been working and what we should be thinking about as a country. And it really delves into these questions about, well, what is the impact of immigration on the labour market, on the housing market, on our infrastructure needs as a country? And it's a strongly evidence-based piece of work. And what it concludes is that where we have these problems, these infrastructure deficits, and housing has obviously been a huge issue in recent years, immigration hasn't been the cause of that. The cause of the housing crisis that we've been coming through has been a failure of policy over a long period of time to build the houses that we need for all of our communities in New Zealand. We are actually now getting on top of that. We are now building enough houses to keep up with population growth, and about 1 in 8 houses in Auckland, for example, has been built under this government. We've built 13,000 state houses now in this term of government. So we've really ramped up the house building, and ultimately the way to get house prices and rents under control is to balance the supply and demand of housing. So it's build, build, build. That's what we need to do if we want to make housing more affordable, as it should be for all people. And the interesting thing about the role of immigration in that is, yep, when migrant communities come into New Zealand, there will need to be decent housing for those people, but we will not build the houses that we need without a well-functioning immigration system that brings in some of the labour and the skills that we need. And in fact, if we drastically reduced immigration now, much of our house building would grind to a halt. The top 2 temporary migrant roles coming into New Zealand are labourers and carpenters. So that tells you a little bit of a story. And it's the same with our other big infrastructure, transport projects and that kind of thing. We've always been a country that's been built on migration. You know, my ancestors only came here about 7 generations ago. My community of Mt Roskill, over 50% of the people who live here were not born in New Zealand, have arrived here and overwhelmingly contribute to New Zealand in an amazing way. So I think we've got to see immigration as a positive. We need to manage it well. We need to make sure we get on top of the infrastructure. And one of the things that Ganesh Nana recommended in his report is that as we develop up the immigration system, we do some work on what's called absorptive capacity, which says that, okay, if in the coming 3 years, I'm just pulling a number out of the air here, we might have an net immigration growth of 200,000 people. What would the additional need that creates in terms of housing, transport, health, education? And then you make sure you line up the investment. And we haven't really done that kind of work in the past. And the government is now starting on that kind of work so that we can make sure that we keep pace.
I also heard that you're ramping up education for New Zealand carpenters and so forth as well. Are you able to tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, definitely. This is a really important thing that Labor has been doing in government, and that is rebuilding really our vocational education system. Grant Robertson often talks about this quite movingly, actually. And he grew up in Dunedin, and he was sort of coming into his teenage years in the early 1990s. We'd been through that big period of free market reform. Unemployment was quite high. Then we had a massive recession around about 1991, 1992. And what happened in that period, you know, when business gets really bad, the economy turns south, who are the first people who go overboard in a business? It's usually the newest people, the youngest people. And we ended up with youth unemployment of kind of like 25, 30% in that period. Apprentices in particular are often the first off. You kept your experienced people. And frankly, we're still dealing with some of that social carnage 30 years later. And Grant always says that, he was always really clear that if he got the opportunity to be in government when we face some of those difficult economic times like COVID or some of the economic challenges we faced after COVID, that we wouldn't let that happen again. And so one of the things we did in COVID, which was the biggest economic shock in 100 years, is we brought in what's called the apprenticeship boost. And it basically said to employers right across New Zealand, we will effectively subsidise you to keep your young people on in those apprenticeship and training roles so that we keep them engaged in work. They're able to continue contributing, they're able to continue earning, and we build up the skills levels that we need to build the houses and all of the other infrastructure that we need. And it's been a massive success, and our apprenticeship and training numbers are now as high as they've been in decades. And we've now made that apprenticeship boost permanent. That was an investment we made in the budget this year. And that also fits in with the vocational education reforms that we've brought in over the last couple of years. So often when people talk about tertiary education, they think universities, which obviously incredibly important for our country. But I think probably in recent decades, we've forgotten a little bit about the vocational education side, and for our government reinvesting in that sector and giving young people those opportunities, including young people who don't want to go down the academic route, find school really hard, but can contribute massively. Some of those opportunities are really important, and we want to back people with them.
Yeah, and also on that point of migration and our New Zealand being, a melting pot of different ethnicities, and like you said, not many of us can go down many generations without realizing that a few ancestors have all come from overseas. I guess that brings me on to the next topic of refugees in New Zealand, which has become a really hot topic in the last few years. So you've announced that the refugee quota is increasing from 1,000 to 1,500 people per year. So I'd like to know what kind of education and all-around wraparound services will our refugees be offered so that they can merge into New Zealand society without feeling excluded? And then, we all know what type of mental health issues and flow-on effects it can have on people if they don't migrate into society very well.
Yeah, well, we're really proud of that increase to quota refugee numbers. And in fact, we've just achieved that. So we set this out as our election policy at the last election, that would increase the total annual numbers to 1,500. It was a bit delayed because of COVID, but we hit that mark in July of this year. So we've achieved that for the very first time. And then on top of that, we've had additional intakes of people from Ukraine and Afghanistan as well. So New Zealand, I think we're proud generally as a nation that we do try and play our part in sharing this country with people who come from often desperate and awful situations in different parts of the world. But your point is a really good one, that it's also about the quality of the experience and support that you provide to those people. And again, that's an area of strength for New Zealand. The entry point for everyone who comes into New Zealand as a refugee is the Mangere Resettlement Centre. And it is world renowned as being one of the best initial experiences for refugees to experience. People go through a 5 to 6 week program there where they are given a lot of support with their physical and mental health, are introduced to what life in New Zealand is like, whether it's how you find employment, access health services, how public education works, just sort of some of the norms of living here, which might be very, very different from where people have come from. And there's a lot of work that's also done at Mangere to connect people with community networks, often from the communities that people have come from. So if you come into that centre as a Burmese refugee, you'd often have a touch point with our local Burmese communities. So you've got friendly faces and someone who speaks your language and knows what it's like to be able to support you. So it's generally recognised as a really good introduction. But if you've come from a totally different environment, it's still a huge adjustment to come and live here. And so there's a lot of work we've got to do there. one of the pieces of work that we're just finishing off now is a refresh of the New Zealand refugee resettlement strategy. And that's basically the big guiding document that says how we will support former refugees to settle well into New Zealand and be able to realise their potential and contribute. We've done a lot of engagement with the former refugee resettled community in New Zealand. And they've told us the strategy will be a bit different to what it's been before. It was previously very focused on economic outcomes, getting a job, and that stuff's still important. But what the community has emphasised to us is that a lot of the stuff around housing and healthcare in particular, if you don't have that stuff right, it's very hard to settle and do well and feel secure and safe after experiencing often significant trauma in your life. So you'll see a lot more coming through in that area. And we put a lot of focus in the initial period of people resettling into trying to make sure that they do get access to stable housing and some of those other things that you need to build your life around. And of course, once people do come here as refugees, they become citizens, and they do have right of access, therefore, to all of the social services, including public education that every other New Zealander does.
I'm curious to know how you decide where you pull your refugees from, because I know you've changed it recently. You've allocated a bit more towards Africa this time. I'd love to know how that process works.
Yeah, we have what's called a regional allocation system where we take our, it was 750, then it was 1,000, now it's 1,500 quota refugees that we receive from the United Nations every year. And we say, well, where do we take those people from? Because in reality, there are tens of millions of refugees, sadly, in the world. So you have to have some system for that. The way that we do that is that we get advice from Immigration New Zealand, who in turn get advice from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So they're the overall international body who manage the international refugee system, and that we take our guidance from in terms of where the needs are and where we can be of most assistance. And so over recent years, we've done a couple of main things since we've been in government. In particular, there was previously a policy that was frankly discriminatory, which very much limited the intake from the Middle East and Africa. And we've changed that. And as a result, we have a slightly higher overall percentage of people coming from those parts of the world. Of course, we have major refugee crisis situations in places like Syria. And we have also increased the overall intake from the Pacific, because we are part of the Pacific. This is our region, our neighbourhood. And then we tend to just sort of work with the UN to assess where the greatest needs are. So, for example, in recent years, it has come down a little bit, or the percentages come down a little bit from South and Central America. And that's been because in some parts of South and Central America, where there was previously quite a high need, that's actually dropped off a little bit. So we reassess that overall regional allocation each year. We have a look at that and just sort of calibrate it to try and get the mix right. But the important thing to note is that because we've lifted the overall numbers to 1,500, even though some of the percentages have moved around a little bit, in every region that we welcome refugees from, we are welcoming more people than we did before.
Michael, Labor are removing the minimum wage exemption for disabled workers on the basis of combating discrimination. But what percentage of employers were already paying within the minimum wage bracket? And could the higher costs now discourage employers from hiring in what is already a scarce hiring market?
Yeah. It's a really important issue, this one, and it's one that the disability community has been raising with successive governments over a really long period of time. And the core of the issue for people who might not be so familiar with it is that we've had a system that's sometimes been called sheltered workshops or gone by other names, where disabled people who have an ability to work and really want to work and contribute, but perhaps work at a lower level of productivity than a non-disabled person would, have worked in these environments, but often at very, very low wages. And so when I say very, very low, our current statutory minimum wage is around about $22 an hour, maybe $4 or $5 an hour. Now, I'm sorry, I don't have the percentages on me about how many people were being paid below minimum wage in that sector, but certainly there were a number of people who were. And it's a challenging issue, because you can understand that the tension, the policy tension here is that for those employers, they're generally trying to do a really good thing, which is provide people in the disabled community with a meaningful access to work, which we want to encourage. Probably if they had to just shell out for the minimum wage or more themselves, they might find it difficult to sustain that. But there is a core question about, it is by definition discrimination if you're a disabled person and you don't have the same legal right to the minimum wage that other people do. So how do you kind of square that circle? That's really what your question is. The way that we've come to in that is to, yes, put in the requirement for the minimum wage. So we're removing that exemption, but we're introducing what's called a wage supplement policy, which effectively means that the government will come in and will help the employer to plug the gap. So all of that additional cost will not go on the employer, because we do want them to continue being able to employ those people, and the government will come in and provide some financial support to make that possible. And that was, it's very timely because that was just something we confirmed at the budget a few months ago.
Yeah, I was actually quite happily listening to that budget.
There's some good stuff there.
Yeah. I was also really interested listening to you talk about electric vehicles. We've got a few questions on that, but we are actually running out of time today. It would be epic to have you back and have a more in-depth discussion over it, because it's a really exciting topic. It also means that we need to come up with a lot more science and so forth to, I mean, just essentially accommodate New Zealand's power grid. Do you think that might be an issue, or do you think we're well set to just be able to go straight through and allow more EVs to come into New Zealand's vehicle fleet and it's not going to affect us too much?
Look, we right across transport, we have to decarbonise. It's our second biggest source of greenhouse emissions. So if New Zealand wants to take action on climate, we've got to decarbonise transport. It means more people on public transport, more people safely walking and cycling, but you also have to change the vehicle fleet to low and zero emissions. So we've just got to do it. We've got to find the ways of doing it. We are okay at the moment in terms of the overall grid, but we're so successful. Our clean car discount policy has been so effective at driving EV uptake that we have to start the planning now for how we do that. So in the coming years, there's not a huge immediate issue around how we generate electricity, but it's about the transmission system. It's about things like smart charging, so that when you plug your car into your charger at home, it works with the electricity grid to, I'm simplifying a whole lot here, to get the power into your car at the right time so that it doesn't overload the grid and that you don't get overcharged for it as well. So we're working on those sorts of parts of the system to make sure that it all works well. And it's absolutely something that I think we can manage, and we need to manage it.
Michael, as it stands, petrol vehicles are 100 times more likely to catch fire than electric vehicles. However, EV fires are far more severe, and fire services around the world are struggling to get adequate training and resources to combat this. How are we preparing our emergency services as we shift towards EVs?
Look, there is, whenever you have vehicles, whatever kind they are, there's always some risk that arises from them. If you're driving around an internal combustion engine vehicle, you're sitting on 50 or 60 litres of a very flammable fluid that can create a disastrous situation. There is equally a small risk that can arise in certain situations from EV batteries. In both cases, and you rightly point to this, the risk is tiny, and overall it's actually less with EVs. But because it's a new technology, there tends to be a little bit more publicity around it when it does happen. So I just say overall, firstly, it's not a big thing for people to worry or be concerned about. But as we bring these new technologies on board, there are probably two key things. One is making sure that we've got really good regulatory standards ourselves. So whatever kind of vehicles or technology we're bringing into the country, that we have confidence that they are safe. And we will continue to monitor that really closely. And then the second thing, as you say, is making sure that whatever environment it's in, whether it's on the ship that the vehicle comes in on, that's something that's been looked closely at now by shipping companies, or whether it's our emergency services in New Zealand, that they understand what the issues are and they're well equipped to deal with them. And that is work that we have underway. One of the things I did set up when I was Transport Minister was I've just forgotten what we called it now, but it was effectively a senior leadership group of people from the electric vehicle sector, the Clean Car Leadership Group. So it brought together the people who import and sell electric vehicles, the industry associations, Consumer New Zealand, and iwi Māori Voice, to kind of work out how we do this EV transition. And that was looking at how do we incentivize, how do we deal with the stuff around the grid that you talked about before, how do we have a charging network that's accessible and equitable for everyone, and we've invested in the budget in that as well. But then also what these regulatory questions around how we make sure the fleet is really safe as well. So it's something we take seriously as a government, and we'll be rolling out more policy and direction on that as the fleet continues to grow.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. We are actually nearing the end of our interview today, but I would like to leave it on a slightly less serious note, because as we know, the world of politics is incredibly serious. It is important, though, that we don't take ourselves too seriously. So can you leave us with the funniest or most memorable moment in your career thus far? And what's the most meaningful lesson your time in Parliament has taught you?
I've now been an MP for 7 years. And I think quite possibly the thing that I'm actually the most well known for in my community of Mt Roskill is that in my very first campaign to be the MP here in 2016, I managed to get McDonald's on Stoddard Road to fix a slushy machine. To me, kind of, and I reflect on sort of some of the weighty topics that I focus on myself sometimes. And actually a lot of people say, oh, you're the guy that did that, including quite a few journalists now who used to come from Mt Roskill. So that was quite grounding for me. The things that people focus on, and maybe the things that people don't focus on so much when you're in these kinds of jobs. And I guess in answer to the second question, look, we talked about some of the tough parts of politics in this discussion earlier on, but at its best, it's about how you make life better for people. And like I look around my community, and we're building hundreds of state houses for people, and that's about getting people off the streets and out of cars and out of bus stops and into warm, dry places where they can be safe and raise their families. I think about some of the work that we've done around, lunches in schools for kids, so that some of the poorest kids in our communities who would be sitting at school hungry, desperately hungry in the afternoons, now get a nutritious meal and can feel good and feel on an equal with the other kids and can learn. Those are the kind of things that we can achieve when politics is done well. And I hope that we can encourage more people to think about engaging in politics, so that we can make life even better for people and solve some of the problems that we do have. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. And of course, a big thank you to our listeners. This has been Hayley, Tracey, and Harita on Conversations with Wāhine. Thank you. Thank you. Kia ora. Thanks, folks.